Get ready to embark on an eye-opening journey with us as we present to you Perceptions, Knowing Your Heritage. This captivating video is filled with fascinating insights and surprising discoveries that will leave you eager to delve deeper into your own heritage. Don't miss out on this incredible opportunity to gain a deeper understanding of who you are. Remember to hit that like button and share this transformative experience with your friends and family.
My name is Olori Olere, and you're welcome to Perceptions, Knowing Your Heritage. Last episode, we looked at Africa from the perspective of slavery. Today, we're going to continue on that. And during last session, we talked about the issue of racism and how that word is synonymous with the black race. Now, looking at the transatlantic slave trade, this particular era redefined the African humanity to the world, stereotyping and damaging human relations. It constituted the destruction of culture, language, religion, and human possibility. Today, we're going to look at the effect of colonization. What caused colonization? And this I would like to refer to as the second scrambling for Africa. Before we start, I'd like to look at a quote from the missionary David Livingstone. He said, and I quote, "During his time, David Livingstone called for a worldwide crusade to defeat the Arab-controlled slave trade in East Africa, and the only way to do this was to liberate Africa by the introduction of commerce, religion, and civilization," as though Africa did not have a structure or civilization of its own. In the 19th century, most powers experienced a dramatic growth triggered by industrialization. Now, I want to reiterate here that colonization to most people seemed to just happen out of the blues without understanding the facts behind the reason for colonization. Now, Europe embarked on a large industrialization scale where it overproduced and they were running out of raw materials and where to sell their goods. So, as a result of that, there was a new demand for agricultural products, which required acquisition of land to grow agricultural products for European markets. Now, industrialization meant that they required less of the human labor. So, slave trade really started to become obsolete at some point because the technology developed by the West produced far more than the human resources could. So along with the rise of industrial revolution and the continuing spread of industrialization came a shift in the strategy to trade with the colonial world. Instead of being primary buyers of colonial products, the industrial nations increasingly became sellers in search of markets for the growing volume of their machine-produced goods. Furthermore, over the years, spices, sugar, and slaves became relatively less important with the advance of industrialization. At this point, the Europeans moved into the interior parts of Africa to extract raw materials to meet their demands. These natural resources made Africa a vital resource for the European economy, and this brought about the Berlin Conference.
Invites to his palace 16 diplomats from the leading Western countries to sit together around a table. Their aim, to divide up between themselves a continent, Africa. And they will succeed.
Of 1884 to 1885. During this conference, which was called by the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, 14 other European countries were present with no representation from Black Africa, from Africa in general. And these countries were Belgium, France, Portugal, Italy, Spain, Great Britain, Austria-Hungary, Denmark, Russia, Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Turkey, USA, and Germany. Partly to gain acceptance, the conference resolved to end slavery by African and Islamic powers. This international prohibition of slave trade was signed by the European members. And in addition to that, the principle of effective occupation started with the colonial powers, where they could acquire the rights over colonial lands only if they possessed them or had effective occupation. Meaning, if they had treaties with local leaders, flew their flags there, or established an administration in the territory to govern it with a police force to keep order. Or the colonial powers could also make use of the colony economically. This principle became important not as a basis for the European powers, but also for determining the limits of their respective overseas possessions. However, because the Berlin Act was limited in its scope to the lands that fronted on the African coast, European powers in numerous instances later claimed rights over lands in the interior without demonstrating requirement for effective occupation. Now the scramble of Africa sped up after the conference, since within areas designated as their sphere of influence, the European powers had to take effective possession by principle of effectivity. And this occurred in Central Africa in particular, where expeditions were dispatched to coerce traditional rulers into signing treaties using force if necessary. The British moved up from the South Africa and down from Egypt, conquering states. Within a few years, Africa was at least nominally divided up south of the Sahara. By 1895, the only independent states were Morocco, Liberia, Ethiopian Empire, Mergentine Sultanate, Sultan of Hobyo, which ruled northern Somalia. Now, this was the logistics to colonization. The three major reasons for colonizations were the control of the trade routes, raw materials, to sell manufactured goods to Africans. That is, the more colonies you have, the more customers you have, and the more money you can make. Hence, the Berlin Conference was held to avoid a war between the European countries over the resources of the African continent. The European colonists went to Africa and split it up piece by piece. Some conquering the colonies through war, while some joined willingly, realizing that resistance was futile, and some joined through a debt trap like Tunisia, owing France money. Once a colony was conquered, the new colony will be ruled by Europeans who will live in the colony, or by pre-existing African rulers who would govern the colony in exchange for doing the bidding of their European overlords. The Africans had to pay tax per person, and it had to be paid in the currency of the European overlords. You may ask, how were native Africans who erstwhile traded in cowries, how were they able to pay their European colonialists? There were two ways they did this. The first was they could either work for European companies in Africa, or they could devote a portion of their land to growing crops and then sell those crops for European currency, then give that currency to their colonial government as tax. Europeans then set up businesses in Africa to exploit those resources. They exploited those resources such as mines for extraction, or infrastructure such as roads, where it made easy transportation from the hinterland to Europe. And when these raw materials got to Europe, of course, they were transformed, like gold to jewelry, cotton to clothing, cocoa to chocolate. The taxes earned from these colonies were spent on administering the colony, providing services to the Europeans living in those colonies, while little was spent on improving the lives of the Africans whose human and natural resources were being depleted. The exploitation of Africa continued for another century. Now, let us talk about the decolonization of Africa. How did this come to be? To start with, let us understand that 3 countries gained their independence without much resistance from the colonial masters. The first was Liberia. This was set up by the United States so that free African slaves or free African American slaves in America could set up their own country, and they declared independence in 1847. Next was South Africa, which had a government which composed of mostly ethnic Europeans who peacefully negotiated for their independence in 1910. And the last was Egypt. Britain basically just said, you know what, we grant you independence willingly. So, the African colonization, what prompted that? This goes back to the era of the Second World War. The Second World War, which lasted for about 6 years, depleted the economy of Europe greatly. They were spent and outspent. After the Second World War, most of the European colonialists started to lose their grips on the territories which they colonized. Let's start with Italy. Italy was severely damaged during the Second World War. And it was at this point that the United States and the USSR put pressure on Italy to give up its colonies. Eritrea was the first colony to gain independence in 1950. Libya gained its independence in 1951. Somalia was the last Italian colony to gain its independence in 1960. The second reason for decolonization was the Cold War. Here, this was a war between the United States, the USA, and the USSR, where they wanted to take power away from Western Europe for themselves. So many independent movements were funded by either the United States or USSR. When a colony became independent, they would decide either to side with the United States or with Russia, which meant less power for Western Europe. And the third reason for Africa's colonization was the African nationalism. Africans themselves demanded freedom, they demanded independence, and they demanded a right to govern themselves. Let's continue on with the British colony. So the British did not want to embark on an expensive long war in holding into their colonies, and they became more open to independence in the 1950s. They were more interested in the resources than in controlling the government. They were okay with independence if they could control the resources. This policy was called neocolonialism. The British tried to establish a system where the diverse ethnic groups in their colonies could cohabit and work together under the leadership of the minority, more educated Europeans, who obviously controlled the power. And they realized that if they wanted to put Africans back in a position of power, it would take them years to teach the Africans the knowledge on how to run a country, the skill which was lost during the colonialization era. Ghana. Ghana, which was initially called the Gold Coast. Ghana was the first colony to gain independence on its own. The British tried to show the Ghanaians the benefits of being ruled under the British rule, giving them free elections with a parliament that had mostly Africans. But they felt that if Africans had more power, they would not ask for independence anymore. And what happened instead was that They formed an African Nationalist Party which demanded immediate self-government. Kwame Nkrumah was jailed for causing an unrest and demanding independence. In 1951, elections in his party won a majority of the parliamentary seats. His party demanded independence from Britain.
Is that you all to stand firm behind us so that we can prove to the world that when the African is given a chance, he can show to the world that he's somebody.
And in 1956, the Gold Coast became the independent country of Ghana. Sudan gained its independence in 1956. Nigeria. The British had a problem decolonizing Nigeria, basically because it had over 250 ethnic groups, speaking over 200 different languages, living together as a colony. Most of the north was Muslim, and it had the largest land mass and population, and it was governed through a system called feudalism. The Yorubas resided in the west. They were the most exposed and they had adopted most parts of the Western culture, and the Igbos resided in the eastern part of Nigeria. Within the three major ethnic groups living together, they did not get along with each other. Yet the British was determined to create a government for an independent Nigeria. In 1957, the British gave a self-government to each of the major ethnic groups. Due to decades of colonialism, these ethnic groups did not have the skills to govern themselves. A system of federalism was introduced in 1959, where each group governed itself. Again, the northern Muslims controlled nearly over 60% of the population, which meant the northerners would always be in the dominant position. As a result of this major ethnic division, no national party could emerge. Rather, parties were split along ethnic groups, along ethnic lines, with each ethnic group voting for its own kind. Eventually, Nigeria gained independence in 1960, and at this point, the people of Nigeria were unsure on how to rule themselves. The result of political parties split along ethnic lines is still visible in the politics of Nigeria up till today. The leaders find it difficult to run the country, and the reason for this is found in how the British set up the colony in such an illogical way, because the country of Nigeria is more ethnically diverse than the whole of Europe. Kenya started a rebellion called the Mau Mau Uprising between 1952 and 1956, but gained its independence in 1962. Sierra Leone and Tanzania gained their independence in 1961. Uganda gained their independence in 1962. Malawi and Zambia gained their independence in 1964. Gambia and Zimbabwe gained their independence in 1965. Botswana and Lesotho gained their independence in 1966. Mauritius and Swaziland gained their independence in 1968. And these were all colonies of the British Empire. Let's look at the French colonies. At this point, France was facing issues elsewhere in its empire, where it lost a war of independence in the colonies of Indochina, that is today's Vietnamese, Cambodia, and Laos. For fear of such repetitions in their colonies in Africa, France embarked on a policy of promoting pro-French Africans into positions of power to show the Africans that they had their interest at heart. Algeria formed a resistance called the FLN in 1954. The cost of war became too much for the French that it gave Algeria its independence in 1962. In Morocco, the French installed a sultan who was supposed who was supposed to do the bidding of the French, but the Sultan became an African nationalist himself and resisted the French colonialists. He refused to put his signature on the demands of the French, and the French replaced him with a new sultan. The Moroccan people did not like it, and then formed their own resistance. Morocco gained her independence in 1956. Tunisia. In Tunisia, the French refused to give the Tunisians more rights. And then they formed a political party to gain more freedom. When they did this, the French exiled their leader. When they went to the UN to address the issue, their leader was arrested. Out of frustration, they created their own resistance movement, and in 1956, Tunisia gained independence. When Guinea refused to offer the offer of the French to either choose independence or remain as a French colonist, the French retaliated by cutting off all government aid, recalled all of the French citizens and professionals, took as much government property they could, and they destroyed the ones they could not. Cameroon gained her independence in 1960. Togo gained her independence in 1960 as well. Mali, Madagascar, and Senegal also gained their independence in 1960. Niger, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, Chad, Central African Republic, Congo, Gabon, Mauritania, and Benin all gained their independence also in 1960. Due to underdevelopment of these French colonies, after decades of French rule, they are still relying on France for support up till today. And these are all the French colonies. The Belgian colony. The Belgians basically colonized the Congo. And this started with the King of Belgium declaring Congo as his own personal property. Congo was turned into a corporation for profit making only, regardless of how many people died in the process. The indigenous were told that they had to work hard for the Belgians. The Belgians built mines, plantations, and railroads across the region. They were given impossible targets to produce resources to hand over to the Belgians. And when they did not do so, they were severely punished, because the Belgian soldiers were told that if they did not do so, they will be severely punished if they return to Belgium. But their compensation will be if they taught the Africans a severe lesson by mutilation or killing them or having them to do despicable things to each other, and bringing a proof of that back to Belgium. Hence the Belgian chocolate of the Black Hand, where parts of Africans, children, adults, male, female, did not matter, mutilations, we are mutilated, and those body parts were taken back to the King of Belgium. And the popular Belgian chocolate, which depicts an African hand, is ridiculously insane. Like I said, many Congolese, including children, had their limbs mutilated. And the term crimes against humanity was actually created specifically to describe what the Belgians did to the Congolese in Belgian Congo. When the Congolese people revolted, the Belgians could not curb their resistance, and then Congo gained its independence also in 1960. At this time, the Congolese were not ready to rule themselves because they were greatly illiterate due to extreme illiteracy. The Belgians still have control of many aspects of Congo to this day, unfortunately. Rwanda and Burundi also gained its independence in 1962. Now let us look at the Portuguese colony. The Portuguese were one of the first to colonize Africa, and they were one of the last to leave Africa. The reason for this was because they felt that the other European colonies went into rebellion because they did not receive proper guidance from their colonial masters. Therefore, they implemented a system called apartheid to prevent the Africans from rising against them in their colonies. Therefore, in the apartheid systems, Europeans and Africans will live apart from each other. Africans will receive fewer rights than the Europeans. They will be told what type of jobs they could get, where they could live, and what type of public services they could use. There was much resistance from the Africans. In Angola fought a war resisting the Portuguese between 1961 and 1974 and gained its independence in 1975. Guinea-Bissau gained her independence in 1974. Mozambique and Cape Verde gained their independence in 1975. The colonies of Spain, now let's look at the colonies of Spain. The Spanish colonies were ruled like the French colonies, with a ruling Spanish population and a small African elite and a large population of Africans that were not regarded as anything significant. Now let's look at Equatorial Guinea, which gained its independence in 1968. Now we can go on and on looking at the whole of Africa as per colonization and decolonization and the effect it's had. Let me mention that Ethiopia was never colonized with respect to Haile Selassie. It's one of the African colonies that was never colonized. This effect has devastated Africa, robbed us of our identity. Basically, we have lost the skill to govern ourselves. Hence, you see poor governance, especially across the sub-Saharan Black Africa. We have lost our sense of religion. We do not even know or respect our own. We have lost our sense of culture, demonizing anything indigenous and respecting anything foreign. We have lost our respect of self. Without understanding our past, we cannot, or rather without knowing our past, we can never understand our present. How can that influence our future? In looking at this and looking at the way forward for Africa, we will look at this in our next episode. In looking at the way forward, let us ponder on three things. How we can make Africa better for the next generation. And we look at few aspects of the African society. Education. The issue of education is critical. Our education has been greatly whitewashed with white history. How about we bring it back home? The world today talks about UDL, Universal Design for Learning, which means you teach as per your environment and how it is indigenous to you. How have we brought that to our children? The aspect of teaching our historical background concerning every aspect of the African ethnic system to our children to understand why we behave the way we behave or how we are. To educate ourselves concerning our indigenous sectors would help shape how we understand who we are. Also, growing our economy from within, industrialization. Our government should look more at implementing or encouraging grassroots industrialization.
Thanks for watching Perceptions, Knowing Your Heritage. Get ready for an incredible journey as we delve deeper into the fascinating world of cultural exploration. Stay tuned for the next thrilling episode.